Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to talk about my 2019 reading goals, wrap them up, and then also talk about stats. And I know many of you love stats, so I made the effort to include them in this video. I'm going to start with looking at my 2019 reading goals, then I'm also going to talk about my Goodreads stats, and then I'll finish off with my Excel spreadsheet, tables, and graphs for your viewing pleasure. In 2019, my first goal was my Goodreads reading challenge goal. That was to read 40 books, which I did do successfully. I read 42 books last year. My second goal was to put closed captioning on all of my solo videos, meaning any videos where it's just me and them, not counting the ones that Les and I did together. I uploaded 21 videos that were just me, and I did do closed captioning on 19 of those. The only two that I didn't do it on were my reading vlogs, because both of those were like 20, 30, 40 minutes, and one of them the subtitles didn't even generate, so I just said, whatever, gonna leave it. So although I didn't quite finish that goal, I'm still very happy with how it ended up. Third was to read the books on my physical TBR bookshelf, which is this thing right here. I started the year 2019 with 87 books on my TBR, and I was actually doing quite well at this until in the fall I bought a bunch of books because I won an Amazon gift card from work and I went to a library book sale. So I actually ended the year with more books on my TBR shelf than I started with. I ended the year with I think 94 books. It was over 90. So yeah, didn't quite do that, but that was also a bit of a fluke at the 3/4 of the way through the year. I wasn't expecting to have that because I don't usually go too crazy when I buy books, but still I did make an effort to at least read the books that were on here more so than in past years. My final goal was to read 4 500+ page books that had been on my TBR bookshelf for a while, and I read 3 of them. I read more than 500+ page books in 2019, but I had like specific rules for this challenge. It didn't count if it was borrowing from somebody or if it was a brand new book. But the ones that I did read were The Forgotten Garden by Kate Morton. This was the one that I read first. Then I read The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown, which I've already given away, so I don't have that one anymore, but I did complete it. The third book that I read was The Distant Hours, also by Kate Morton. I had such success with The Forgotten Garden that I decided to read another one of her books, and this one took me a lot longer to read because I didn't like it as much, so I think that's kind of what affected my fourth read. Is just I kind of ran out of time and I wasn't really feeling motivated to try to squeeze in a 500+ page book on top of a couple other reads that I wanted to do in December. So I just let it be. I read 3 of the 4 on that one. So all right, decent enough. And then finally there was one extra goal that wasn't originally in my goals video, but I kind of threw it on here just so I could keep track of it. And it was my 9 books for 2019 that I wanted to do. So in the interest of time, because this is probably going to be a longer video, I won't talk about each of the 9 books, but there was 7 of them that I read to completion. There was 1 of them that I DNF'd, which was Big Weather. I've already gotten rid of that one as well because I got about 100 pages in, which is almost halfway through the book, and I couldn't do it anymore. A book about tornadoes should be exciting, and it was incredibly boring, and there was way too many people being talked about in it. So many storm chasers, I couldn't keep track of who people were, so I just decided to give up on it. The last book that I didn't finish, I did start, and that was We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. I started this in October because I thought it would be a good creepy read, and I got about 50 pages into it. I still have the bookmark in there, and I just wasn't feeling it. The writing is kind of intense and the font is very small and fills up basically the entire page. Like they squeeze the stuff into the margins in this edition, and so it wasn't right. I'm still trying to decide if I'm gonna give it another go or if I'm just gonna give up on it. So if you have any thoughts about that, you can leave them below. So out of the 9 books, read 7, and I at least touched on the other 2, gave them a good effort, which was better than I did in 2018 with my 8 books. So I'm pretty happy with that one. Overall, for my goals, I feel like I did a decent enough job. I feel like my reasons for not completing certain ones all the way to the very end are reasonable, so I'm certainly not beating myself up over them. Next, let's take a look at my Goodreads stats. So I read, as I mentioned, a total of 42 books, and that on Goodreads equated to 15,547 pages. I did read a number of audiobooks, and I do log the audiobook version, which usually only has 5 or 6 pages according to Goodreads, since it's not actually the physical book. So I guess you could say I physically read 15,547 pages, and then you could throw some extras on there if you wanted to count the audiobook as well. The shortest book that I read was Saga Volume 9 at 152 pages, and the longest book I read was Gemina, which has 659 pages. That was one of the 500+ page books. I read Gemina and Obsidio last year, but I also acquired them within the year, so I didn't count them for that specific reading goal. My most popular book that I read was The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. 1.2 million people have logged that book as read. I am not surprised. I have read it before, but I decided to reread at least the first one this year. And then my least popular book was Hidden Cities, which has 1,336 people marking it as read. That was actually a book that Les gave me for my birthday. My average rating for 2019 was 3.6. which is decent. I feel like that's usually around where my Goodreads rating is. I have a pretty good idea of what I think I'm going to like these days, so I'm good at picking books that are going to be 4 stars at least for me. But I mean, I still had a fair amount of 3 stars too, but I'm good with the 4 stars. And then the highest rated book on Goodreads that I read was, unsurprisingly, Saga Volume 9 at 4.57. That would probably be because if you're going to continue on with the series, you obviously like the series, so the farther you get, the more you're going to be invested in it and like it. So the fact that Volume 9 of a graphic novel series has the highest rating, that's not surprising. That is it for my Goodreads stats. So now we're going to get into the harder, more complicated stats. I did not use a specific spreadsheet this year. In the past, I have used other booktubers' spreadsheets, but this year I just decided to create my own very simple one and just add in the columns that I felt like I would want to share come year end. So there are a number of categories here, but it's not as complicated or as intense as it has been in years past. Starting with the books, we can look at the genres that I read. My most read genre in 2019 was fantasy with 8 books, which is surprising, but I think I know why. I participated in the Femme Fatale readathon, and so that had me reading a bunch of fantasy books. And then there were 2 series that I started during that time that I continued reading throughout the year, and although I didn't finish them, that definitely bumped up the number of fantasy books. Those were all YA, so I got through them pretty quickly. If this was adult fantasy, that would not have been the case. Me and adult fantasy just don't really jive most of the time these days. My second most read category was memoir, which also surprised me. Memoir technically falls under nonfiction, which makes sense because I do read a fair amount of nonfiction. And then to kind of pair in with that, I read 4 other straight up just sort of nonfiction books. So if you combine those together to make a nonfiction category, that is my biggest one. So kind of makes sense. As far as the other ones, I mean, fiction, graphic novels, historical fiction, mystery, romance was actually, the fact that romance is even on here is a little surprising, the fact that it even had an entry, but I mean, I think they were YA books, but they were kind of categorized more as romance than anything. Moving on to pages, so how big were the books that I was reading? The first thing to note is that I did read 2 books that were over 600 pages, and I already mentioned them, Gemina and Obsidio. Because there are mixed media, it's not just entirely text, so it's definitely a little bit easier to read. I read 6 books that were between 500 and 599 pages, and 3 of them were part of that goal that I had for myself. And then I think 2 of them were Crazy Rich Asians and China Rich Girlfriend by Kevin Kwan. And then I can't remember what the other ones were, but that's pretty good. And then 15 books, 300 to 399, 10 for 200, 299, like that makes sense. 8 books for over 400 pages, like that's all pretty standard. I didn't read any super short books this year. Even the Saga volume that I read was probably the one that was 100 to 199 pages. format for those books that I did read. Hardback is the smallest category at 8. I tend to not go for hardback books, but I do have a number of them on my shelf here. Most of the time if I have a hardback book, it's because I picked it up at a library book sale cheaper. I don't usually buy books brand new. Rarely do I buy books brand new, so hardback's definitely the least represented on here. Paperback is my preferred method of experiencing a book, so having 24 of those makes sense. And then audiobook is 10. I read a bunch of audiobooks up until September, and then for those last few months of the year, I didn't read any. I just wasn't in the mood for them. I decided to focus more on podcasts. So audiobooks could have been higher, but just not the way it worked out this year. 24 paperback books equates to 57% of the books that I read, which makes sense. And then 24% for audiobooks, that also, you know, and 19% hardback, all lines up. We'll move on to publication year. I didn't read anything earlier than 1980. I didn't read any real classics this year, which isn't surprising. I'd say every year I maybe read one older classic book. I just didn't end up reading anything quite like that this year. So I had 2 books that were from the 80s, 1 from the 90s, and then 3 between 2000 and 2009. The bulk of what I read was 2010 to 2015 at 18 books, which makes sense. I usually tend to read backlist books because, like I said, I don't buy a lot of brand new books. 2016 to 2018 also had a pretty high representation considering it was 3 years. But once again, you know, you pick up books that somebody else read once that had just come out, and then they let them go and you pick them up. So you're reading them a couple of years after, but still within the time frame of getting to sort of enjoy the excitement of them. And then I actually read 5 books that were published in 2019. Most of those were probably audiobooks because those are really easy to get from the library. That's how I listen to my audiobooks. I have a couple apps that my library is associated with, so I just go back and forth between the 2 of them and pick whichever book I'm in the mood for. And then I also did take out at least 1 book, physical book from the library that was released in 2019 that I knew was coming, and like I put myself on the list and was ready for it. That was Kid Gloves. That was the book that I enjoyed. That's a graphic novel that I enjoyed. For age group, I read 26 adult books and 16 young adult books. No middle grade this year. I usually have maybe 1 or 2 middle grade books, but that did not happen this year. The adult books accounted for 62% of my reading, and the young adult accounted for 38%. That's not particularly surprising, only because I did read a bunch of YA fantasy books in 2019, and I generally don't read that much YA. So that inflated that number a little bit, but not too much. Moving on to what I gave for ratings, I decided to track half stars for myself since Goodreads doesn't do that. So I did have 1 book that was 2 stars and another book that was 2.5 stars. So but that was the lowest I had, at least. I did have a DNF, which I don't include in the ratings because I didn't finish it, but I didn't have anything that I actually forced myself to read all the way through and still gave 1 star. 13 books were 3 and 6 were 3.5. That makes sense. My standards are definitely higher as I get older in terms of what I expect from a book. So I tend to have a nice solid chunk in 3, but also at the same time 3 is a decent rating. It's not horrible, but obviously you want the books you read to be 4 or hopefully 5 stars. You don't want to have everything be in 3 stars. Having 17 books in 4 and 4.5 and 1 in 4.5 is good. That's very good for me. I only gave 3 books 5 stars. I think it was the same case last year. I'm picky, I'm judgmental, I'm a snob, I guess at this point you could say, so I can't help it. I have high standards. Now I want to talk about 3 categories that have to do with the authors that I read. So I did break it down by gender. So I said male, female, or both. Female was 27 at 64% of the books that I read. It is important to note that within that category there is 1 trans female author as well. Male was 13 books and that was 31% of what I read. And then I did have 2 books that were jointly co-written, male and female. That was Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff for Gemina and Obsidio. So that does have its own little 5% category in this. But having my female authors be slightly more than half of what I read makes sense. I just generally seem to lean more towards female authors. I feel like it's been like this for a long time. I never have had to try to split my reading 50-50. I think I just always lean a bit more towards female authors. As far as whether or not the author was white or a person of color, with stuff like this, you're very obviously putting people in a box. It's hard to express the nitty-gritty of somebody's background in a chart like this. So I am simplifying it just for the fact of taking a look at my own choices when it comes to reading. In years past, I have made efforts to reach a certain percentage of books that I read, like 25% to be from authors of color. But I stopped doing that 2 years ago now, maybe 3, just because I felt like I had enough books that I had my eye on now, and I was hearing enough about different authors on BookTube that I was just gonna generally have a better percentage. So this year I read 33 books by white authors and 9 books by authors of color. I would prefer it to be at least a quarter of the books that I read. I think just, yeah, I do wish that that was a little bit stronger. At least 25% or higher I would have been much more satisfied with. And then finally, the last category that I have is looking at the country where the author is born or has spent most of their life in. Like, what does maybe that author consider their nationality to be? Once again, some of them, they're born somewhere, grew up somewhere, but also have been, spent the last 30 years living in another country. So it's a little hard to exactly decide where they should fall. So going in alphabetical order, I had Australia, Canada, Cyprus, Japan, Pakistan, Singapore, the UK, and the USA represented in 2019. My highest representation was the USA at 23 books, or 55% of my reading, which is unsurprising. The US books definitely have a large hold over the Canadian market as well, which is where I live. Having grown up in the US, I obviously heard a lot about US books, and now being in Canada, a lot of those books still come over this way, and they also permeate all over the world too. So having 23 books by American authors, not surprising, but the fact that it's just barely half is pretty good, I guess. I'm actually quite surprised that the UK was only 1 book this year. I feel like that doesn't really happen. Usually I have a few. But Canada at 8, which was 19%, that's pretty decent. I think that's good. Australia was 5 books at 12%, but that's because, once again, Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, like, they're both Australia, so that's great that they're well represented in there. And then I had Cyprus, Japan, Pakistan, they were all 1 book as well, so that equals 2%. And then it's also worth noting, Singapore was 5% because I read 2 of the Crazy Rich Asian books. Those are all the stats I have to share with you today. If you have any questions or comments regarding them, definitely leave them in the comments below. If you're interested in seeing my 2020 reading and channel goals, I'll link that video as well. That's already filmed and posted, so you can go check that out and see what I'm hoping to accomplish this year. If you have any questions or comments regarding the stats that I talked about today, or if you're wondering what specific book might have accounted for a particular number, let me know down below and I can go figure that out for you. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you later.